Good afternoon, brothers and sisters. My name is Malachi Johnson. I'm a young mentee of attorney Malik Zulu SHABAZZ. Before we begin, our guest speaker, Dr. Amy Jenkins, I want to give a background of who I am and my experiences with the public education system. I'm a young millennial with a degree in English from the University of Maryland, Eastern Shore. My experience with public education has been one of self-determination and one of personal experience. You know, growing up, you're taught out of a book. You know, they say 90% of learning starts at home. My father taught me a lot. He gave me what I needed. You know, he also gave me what the school didn't. You know, growing up and being in the public education system, you learn how to cope with a lot. You learn how to you learn truths and then you learn other truths. But there's so much on my mind right now. Growing up in the public school system, you're taught by majority white teachers. You know, they teach you out of a book. They teach you the history of white America. They teach you the history that they've been taught. They teach you the history that they want to teach you. You know, sometimes you have to go outside yourself. You have to go outside of what you're taught to learn the truth. You know, I didn't learn most of what I learned until I got in college. I did research and stuff like that. I got in college when I was 17. That's when I really opened up. That's when I really started looking at a lot of videos. You know, I looked at Dr. Umar, I looked at other philosophers, James Small, and that's when I really started to open up myself to different ideas and question other things. A lot of people nowadays do not question what they taught, or, you know, they don't think, oh, maybe this is wrong, maybe that is wrong. You know, growing up as a millennial, growing up in the public school system, you're not taught to question a lot of things. You're not taught to think. You're not taught to wonder why it is. You know, I used to ask questions, and when I remember in 4th grade, I used to ask, were there black people in this, were there black people in that, and being looked upon strangely. And over the years, I learned that, you know, you have to teach certain things because it's not going to get taught. When it comes to children, when it comes to young people, you have to teach them certain things outside of school because they're not going to get taught certain things in school. They're going to ask questions and they're going to give the answers they expect them to give. You have to educate your children, educate them on their history, their come up, their side of the world. You know, black people have been on this earth for centuries, for thousands of years, millions. You know, we started civilization. We're not taught that, you know, so, you know, before Dr. Amy comes on, from a millennial's perspective, from a millennial's point of view, we have to educate our children at a young age. We have to tell them about ourselves, our ancestors, our history. We have to do what other people won't do. We depend on other people or expecting other people to educate your kids. We'll give you the same results we've been getting, the same passive results. You wonder why our generation is so passive? Because we haven't learned to be aggressive. We haven't learned to take the initiative. We haven't learned to do as much for ourselves as we should. You know, that starts with the public education system. You're taught from the time you're, 3 or 4 years old, you're allowed to go, you start pre-K and all the way through grade school, you're taught a certain way. You're taught not to think, you know, you're taught not to think for yourself, you're taught to think out of a book. You know, having personal education or having been self-taught or been taught about yourself, amongst yourself, by yourself, for yourself will help you along your journey in terms of understanding how things work, in terms of understanding how far we come as people and how far we need to go. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce Dr. Amy Jenkins so she can more so break it down and really give you perspective of why self-education and why self-determination should be a goal among African Americans, a goal among Black families, and among our people in general. So without further ado, Dr. Amy Jenkins.
Okay, I want to welcome everyone to SHABAZZ University. It's a pleasure for you all to join us today. One of the things I want to talk about is I want to do a continuation, and I want to thank Brother Malachi for his introduction as to why education is important. But I want to continue on that path a little bit and just discuss with you pretty much why SHABAZZ University offers so much, will offer so much enrichment to our people. It's important to understand education stems from our home environment, and it stems from a cultural, historic relevance. It has a historic, cultural relevance. But most importantly, it's the way that we continue into the new paradigm of a new future and a new era and a new generation. These things are fundamental. We need to pass them on. Education, we have fallen below a certain threshold of what it means to be an African people because we are not basically instilling and keeping the traditions and the ethical foundation of what we've been taught throughout history with our own families. And, you know, the consequences of a lack of education is a lack of financial wealth and prosperity, a lack of understanding of our children, a lack of poor grades, poor quality in regards to self-determination, poor qualities of a human being, such as the prison to pipeline system. All these things are major in the destruction of our people. So when we take the context of education, we have to give thanks for universities, especially that teach the tools for our children in order to survive and to survive in this world in which we live. So education, as far as SHABAZZ University, I just want to say that is one of the most important things. Now it is time for all of us to actually no longer complain about the circumstances that press our nation. Now it is time for us to actually make a change, make a foundational, foundation. We have the foundation, lay the foundation, and be able to follow this course or this path that's going to get us to a new paradigm of a way of doing things. We will no longer leave our children behind and let them be a mockery of or remain a mockery of the true intelligence, of natural intelligence that we as human beings actually have. We are an educated people. Actually, we're more smarter than many. We come from an African way of thinking. Our brains are more advanced. And I'm not just saying this from a philosophical standpoint, but I am saying this from a scientific standpoint. What makes us great, our minds are just as strong as any other human being. And what we have to instill in our children is that we have everything it takes to be one of the smartest and most educated people of this nation. And in fact, we are the most smartest and educated people of this nation. So without further ado, I want to go on to pretty much, I want to talk about my class and what I'm going to present today. The class in which I'm going to talk about today, we're going to talk about a rites of passage for young girls. It is important that I discuss the rites of passage for young girls because we have to, before we can even think of education, we have to begin to understand how do we get to education? How do we begin to even talk about the topic of education? And how do we come to SHABAZZ University? How can we grow to appreciate Black universities and give them more credit and understand that this is not a new tradition. This is an old tradition. And it is something that we must keep in context. We must make sure that we're preserving what is actually ours and what has actually been ours from the beginning. We have been educating since our times back in Africa. It's just now that our people have gotten to such a point where we have been taught that education is not as important. We now have to bridge the gap and say, hey, you know what, within our people, it is definitely important. And we have to let our children understand that they won't be criticized for a certain way of training. Because see, what has happened is that we have a previous history of training through the state education system. There is a way that they train our students. There's a way that they train our minds. but the reconstruction has to occur with our own institutions. Let me make that clear. The reconstruction of the human mind must occur with our own Black institutions. The reconstruction period happens now. When we talk about SHABAZZ University and other universities, we have to keep that in context. In order for our people to work in a systematic, self-determined way of living and thinking and doing, we have to reconstruct the mind. We have to take them through the fundamentals, but in addition to the fundamentals, make sure that all those things like science and math and philosophy are all related to what it is that we fundamentally and naturally possess, meaning put it into context of living as an African. And that's what I'm here to do. I'm here to show you guys where it stems from. So I want to go ahead with the Rites of Passage program, and I want to talk about the Rites of Passage for young girls. Again, my name is Dr. Amy Jenkins, and again, I welcome you all to a free orientation class provided by SHABAZZ University. Hopefully, after taking a look at SHABAZZ University and what it has to offer, you guys will decide to continue on with the university and will decide to say, hey, you know what, I'm going to go online and I'm going to go ahead and register. I'm going to go ahead and change my way of thinking and try to get into a self-determined way of thinking and being in charge of your own intellect and your own perseverance and self-determination, and be in charge of your own faculties. So we're going to give you that opportunity. So I want to welcome everyone to the Rites of Passage program for Girls 101. Today we're going to take a look at the following: the history of the Rites of Passage as it stems from Africa. And we're going to take a look at it in America. We're going to take a look at how it correlates with childhood and adult education. We're going to take a look at ethics and morals being preserved. And we're going to take a look at the structure and a complete overview of the program, the results that we get, and the examples. Now, we may not be able to cover everything in this one session. But over the next few weeks, we're going to be able to talk about some of the things of the Rites of Passage program, but we're going to also be able to talk about these topics in detail. So I want to go ahead and take you guys through a short summary of the history. Okay, let's take a look at the history. If we were to take a look back in history, the Rites of Passage program, of course, we know is not just a course or a class that you actually take in Africa. The roots are far greater and more significant than we think. We must take a look at the context. If we are the context of the situation, it was practiced as it was practiced in Africa. That's important. Africans have always believed in a holistic approach, okay? And I restate that, a holistic approach to living. In order for people to live holistically, according to the natural rights given to man for his own survival, it was necessary to concentrate on the total mind, body, and spirit. Okay, so we got to take that and look at that in the context. We're talking about the total mind, body, and spirit. And Rites of Passage was that way to train the mind, body, and the spirit on the African continent. It was a way to train African people. The principles of practice of treating our mind, our body, and our spirits in Africa are deeply rooted in what is called culture. It's rooted in African culture. African people, no matter what part of the world they live in, they're supposed to treat the total mind, body, and the spirit. So that's the context in which we come from. That's the historical relevance in which I speak of. So when we're looking at a Rites of Passage, we have to know that as an African people, the main mission of that was to treat our bodies, to treat our intellect and our minds, and to treat our spirit. So let's take a look at the terms really quickly. In order to define what Rites of Passage is, we have to actually know what the words mean. And to know what the words mean, we have to look at what is called rights, the term rights, and we're going to look at the term passage. Let's go with the formal definition, okay? Let's go with a formal definition from Wiki. Now, by definition, rights are basically what is called like legal entitlements. They're like a legal, a social, or an ethical principle, or freedom, or an entitlement. It's a right that is fundamental, is a normative rule, which is allowed by the people. So the people are basically allowing this rule, or setting this rule for you to follow. And it's according to some system, okay? There's some system, some social convention, or some ethical theory. Rights are essential and are important, and an important discipline as a matter of law or as a matter of ethics. Now let's take a look at passage. What does passage mean? So when we take a look at passage, we have to look at it as it's an act, okay? It's an act or a process of moving through, under or covering something or past something, on the way to a place of another. So that means on to another place, all right? The definition. So if we look at, we're going to try to come up with this definition here. And if we take those two terms, we come up with a concrete definition. So if we must put the two words together, we understand that a rite of passage is a journey or a passing of a person into a new position that has been granted and recognized by members of that community. It is a passage that has been authorized or allowed by members of the community who have already reached that level of attainment. It is a transition from childhood to adulthood. Now, let's talk about the types of passages for women. We must understand, or for young girls and women, we must understand that a rite of passage is continuous. And when you go through our first initiation, it marks the different stages of our lives. It helps women to understand and manage our milestones and manage those transitions from childhood to adulthood. I personally have a personal experience with this as I went through Rites of Passage program at the age of 12. And I give honor and thanks to my former ancestor, Baba Lightfoot Bey, as he was the main one who introduced me to a group of women who ran a Rites of Passage program in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. Normally, at the age of initiation, the initiation normally takes place at the time of your puberty, a woman's puberty. And for some women, for me, it was at the age of 10. For some people, the age of puberty will start at the start of your menstrual. And for some, that varies, okay? For some women, for some young girls, it's 10. For some young girls, it's 14. So normally the initiation period for a Rites of Passage program starts at the time of puberty. I remember in the Rites of Passage program, when I started puberty, it was the most magnificent experience of my life. I was greeted by a number of elders in the community, and there was a number of girls, all around similar ages, and we did everything, all learning, all training, all educating the mind, body, and spirit. But one thing I want to talk about is that there is an oath that takes place in Rites of Passage. And pretty much that oath is something that we as women talk about, or young girls talk about, and we're kind of sworn to secrecy. This secrecy is kind of practiced even in Africa. What happens in your Rites of Passage program remains a secret to the outside society of your initiation, as well as it remains a secrecy to men. These are the tools in which we use in order to take care of our families, to educate our minds, to learn a new way of living and operating as a Black woman. And we are sworn to this oath that is sacred. So I won't get on to the personal oath that I've actually taken, but I won't talk about those details. But what I will talk about, and what I am here to do, is actually give you the structure, the historical relevance, and the results, and show some examples. Now, for further information in regards to the Rites of Passage program, and to get your child actually involved in some of the intricate parts of a Rites of Passage program, I ask that you visit www.SHABAZZUniversity.com. There you will be able to register to your child, and they will be able to take part into a Rites of Passage program. Remember, the Rites of Passage program lasts for a lifetime. It is something that your children will always remember. It is something that they will take and practice the principles that are exemplified within their class. It is very important that we as a people understand and respect this oath that we take as women in Rites of Passage. And for your child to actually have that same experience, I request, and I call it mandatory, for your child to register. So please do that at www.SHABAZZUniversity.com. So I'm going to go a little bit further into Rites of Passage, and I'm going to talk about the transition in life and program of structure. You know, the Rites of Passage program, when we're talking about transitions, the reason why it was developed is because African people understood that there were certain transitions that will occur in a person's lifetime, especially in a woman's lifetime, and it goes the same for men. In life, we experience a number of these transitions. Some of the transitions are birth. Okay, at the time we are born, the African people believe that there were certain talents and certain gifts, such as your date of birth, your time of birth, the purpose for your life, a life path number. So all of these things were talked about, and the birth was a major milestone in the start of life. But most importantly, it exemplified what your gifts were and what you would be good at, your destiny. So all of these things, such as astrology and all of these things, play a part. Numerology, divination, all of that plays a part into when we're talking about Rites of Passage. Birthing and naming ceremonies. The meaning of your name was a major significant factor in the Rites of Passage. You know, these are the things we talk about. I'm talking about the things that are discussed in Rites of Passage. Your birth name and how relevant it is, what the name stands for, what the name means. In African tradition, there was power behind a person's name. My name is Dr. Amy, and of course, there's power behind my name. And as you grow and as you learn and as you talk about the name, you realize the context in which it was used and the ancestors who actually try to transition through you with those names. All right. So I give respect to Amy Garvey, and I give respect to both Amy Garveys because, again, the name definitely is significant. Let's talk about another reason, another thing that happens when we're talking about the transitions of life. Another thing about the transition of life is we talked about birth and names, but then we talk about adulthood. All right, this adulthood that actually happens. And adulthood, the reason why I address adulthood before the reason why I talk about adulthood before I discuss puberty is because they're kind of correlated. In fact, they are very relevant to each other. because in Africa, at the time that a person goes through puberty, they have actually entered into adulthood. With adulthood, there comes responsibility, there comes understanding self-determination, there comes a number of skills and problem solving and rules that we must follow. There is a way of thinking about society, the rules of dealing with society. And then, of course, all of that is tied into at the time that you hit puberty. Now, with puberty, we're talking about that initiation stage, the initiation. At the time of initiation, what I will say and what I will divulge to you is that the initiation is really called the rebirth. It's the time in which a woman is reborn. She's not so much reborn. Well, let me talk about the rebirth. The rebirth happens from a child to an adult. It's taking a woman from a child to an adult. So that is called the rebirth. And during the puberty or the initiation phase, you are tested. You are taught by the elders certain secrets of how to maintain family, how to take care of children, how talked about sex, procreation. These are some of the things that are talked about, as well as how to conduct yourself as a woman, and most importantly, how to take care of a family, your husband. So these are very important things, but it's an incredible experience, but it just doesn't stop at the initiation phase. So during the rites of passage program, you're also taught about circumcision. Now, this is a big topic because, you know, in America, the rites of passage program, the question is, in America, do we have circumcision? How is that related to rites of passage? We're going to talk about that in more detail on another segment, but I'm not going to talk about it right now. However, I am going to mention this about circumcision, is that in Africa, it was a normal practice for, in many, not all, but it was definitely a practice within some African countries for a woman to be circumcised. I do know of a woman who was circumcised from Ghana, and it was definitely an experience. I don't want to share her experience. These are some of the experiences that we would share together in a woman's circle. But I will say that circumcision has been a practice in African culture. Circumcision here in America, you know, with American rites of passage programs for Black girls is quite different, where we do not practice circumcision. But we do talk about circumcision and how it relates to an African woman and what it means to be a circumcised woman and why it was done historically. Moving on, we also talk about another transition in rites of passage, which we talk about marriage, okay, marriage. And we talk, there's a high value placed on marriage. And that is significant to the rites of passage program because with marriage, the woman is supposed to be an helpmate. And that comes from a biblical context, and a spiritual context and a cultural context of the African people. We also talk about elder roles. What is expected of you as a woman once you reach the age of majority, that elder role, once you reach the age of the elderly. So it is taught to us how our behaviors should be and what is our role once we hit that age. Lastly, another thing that is talked about in a rites of passage program is ancestorship and death. A lot of times people don't have a real reality of what it means to be an ancestor. And the reality of it is that we need to learn more about what an ancestor is, the power of an ancestor, life after death, and when does death really occur? We have to grow to appreciate death and not and understand it in African culture. It is not just a time of mourning, but it's also a time for celebration. So we have to take a look at, in the context of an African, to see exactly what death means and what it means for our parents or our grandparents, and and the people who have passed before us, which are now our ancestors, what type of power that is, what type of power do they have, what type of significance do they still have in our lives. So these are some of the things that we will definitely discuss in the Rites of Passage program. Now, all of these things that we're discussing about transition in life and the program structure, we're going to take it a step further and actually really discuss and see how it correlates to education. Because really, this is what we're talking about. We're talking about, how does this really make sense when we're thinking about, how does this teach my child? How is it correlated to my children learning how to create a great oratory or expository writing? How does it correlate to my child learning mathematics? How does it correlate to my child being able to understand or being more of a social person and social learning skills? So all of these things play a part into this. You know, we got to put it in context and show you how the Rites of Passage program is in direct correlation with education. Rites of Passage is the root and the start of the education process. See, a lot of times we dismiss what it takes for us to even get to education, but we have to understand that the Rites of Passage program is the start of that education. It begins where the person, it's not even just the start, because really we start from childhood, from a baby. We learn things from our parents, we learn and we go on, but when it starts to make sense and how to use our problem solving skills, that all happens in what we call adulthood. And if I go back, remember what I stated is that adulthood actually takes place at the time of what? Puberty. And I gave you an example of my puberty starting at 10 years old as an example. I told you this as an example because that means that my problem solving skills began at the age of 10. Everybody understand? Hopefully we're on the same page. So when you're thinking of children and young children, you think that, oh, they are absolutely, they don't, you believe that their minds are not capable of critical thinking, analysis, being able to put concepts together at such a young age. But as we tend to look at our children, we start to see that during the age of puberty, they're able to do great problem solving tasks. And so some of these tasks that we give them, we see that they're able to resolve them successfully. And a part of that takes place, all of that is a part of the education process. All right, we're given certain tasks at a certain age because that is called the age of adulthood. So the correlation to education. The Rites of Passage has been an important piece of creating a strong number of positive, great examples for our women throughout history. The women that I'm going to show you are a fitting example of how a journey in life has paved the way to a life of perseverance, one of self-determination, and of being a productive part of your community, of our community. So some of the women in which I want to talk about, I'll just briefly show you as an overview. Of course, if we can see Harriet Tubman, okay? So that's one of the women, but I'm going to show you a number of others. Shirley Chisholm, Coretta, Betty Shabazz, Rosa Parks, Mama Fanny. Asada. Shakur. Winnie Mandela. Mama Winnie. Amy Garvey. Amy Garvey. What I want to say is that with these women, the reason why I showed you is because when we take a look at history and we take a look at the women that have come before us, we have to come to terms with the fact that with all of these women, it's kind of saying, what do they have in common? What do all these women have in common, and how is the education of these women correlated? In fact, how do these women, what does it have to do with rites of passage? I mean, what does that have any significance with rites of passage? I mean, did they go through a program? I don't think maybe they went through a program. Let's look at Florence Kennedy. So the question again is, how is this relevant? Maya Angelou. What do all these women have in common? But see, what we have to realize is that how they correlate with each other is through education. You know, a lot of times we don't see their background, we don't see their upbringing, we don't see their household, we don't know what took place when they were a child. We may hear about their stories, we can go into long spurts about what they've been through, but we all know that these are great women in our history, great Black women in our history. And one thing that I would like to share with everyone is what correlation do they have to each other, and how do they come with the same type of self-determination? Each of these women had this great self-determination that stems from a root. There is a root of all of this. And so when we take a look at these women, we cannot dismiss what is called the ethical, moral standpoint in which they have been taught. So now hopefully it's going to make a bit more sense to you as to why we've developed a rites of passage program and in America, and the significance of rites of passage in Africa. When you are in African, when our people were in Africa, there were certain norms and traditions. The reason why I took you through the example of what rites are and what a passage is because the elders have allowed this journey to occur. So what I am saying is that the elders have given a passage, has said, we agree to allow you to complete this journey. You are given certain rights to complete this journey. But the rights that you're given are the rights that you need to, are part of your culture. And they have a cultural relevance. So these women that I just showed you share what is called a cultural similarity. And it stems from their ancestors. It stems from the rights that was given to them. It stems from the rights that was given to them by their mothers, by their great grandmothers, by the women and the other influences in their life. You know, normally when we take a look at psychology and we take a look at philosophy, we start to think about how do women come together of the same frame of thought? How do they begin to have some of the same practices as going into the kitchen, preparing a meal, sewing, doing household chores? How do we all come up with the same type of rationale to be a provider, to be not a provider, but a person who is a self-help to our families? How do we come with this perspective to be women-like? And the whole theory of this is that we share a commonality. And the commonality that we share is in our culture, the culture in which we come from, all right, which we are a part of, which is an African culture. And, you know, in Africa, of course, these foundations and these principles have already been laid for us to follow. So when we talk about, when we take a look at education, we cannot dismiss our education comes from our ethical principles and the ethical foundation that has been laid by our ancestors. So generation to generation to generation, we begin to follow the practices and the principles that have been exemplified from those who have come before us. So what these women share in commonality, what they share together is being a part of a group of women that all have in common this cultural significance, this cultural relevance, this cultural history. So they all share that. And that culture within us, it allows us to begin to talk about what is called ethics. And when we talk about ethics, we have to really come up with a clear definition of what ethics, what is it? What is ethics? Ethics is the ability to understand what is right and what is wrong, okay? What is correct and what is not correct behavior. So in ethics, we have things of that's called African ethics, African code, the African principles. All of these things stem from what is called African ethics. Now in America, what we have done is we've put these African moral code and put the African ethics into the idea of what's right and what's wrong, and we put that into a program. And that program becomes what we now describe as a rites of passage. Because really what it is that we're talking within these programs about how does a woman transition from a child to womanhood. The transition happens by taking certain steps. The initiation is only completed once a woman or a young girl has taken those steps in order to transition into a woman. In order to do this, you have to be able to understand what those steps are. And the problem with our young girls today is that they don't understand the steps. So a lot of times we get confused about what is our role as a woman. And sometimes for young children, this can be very confusing. They have no idea in how they should operate. They have no idea of what's expected of them as a woman, because what has happened is that the steps in which they were to follow or are to follow has been not provided to them. There are more copies to this. I'm just going to need a couple more copies. Thanks. There are other steps in which there are a series of steps that must be taken in order for a woman to transition into womanhood. Okay, so when I'm talking about these transitions and education and how it all relates, it relates because we have to look at what is called ethics. We have to look at the principles. We have to understand what these principles are. So right now, what I want to talk about with you is one of the things that is first primary principle, and this is norms, okay? And when we take a look at ethics, we have to begin to understand what are norms. You know, every day you get up in the morning, you eat breakfast, you have, you know, maybe your lunch on time at 12 o'clock, or you get up at 9 o'clock. Let's say every day, you know, you punch a clock from 9 to 5. If you punch a clock from 9 to 5, that's normally a norm. It's something that you normally do Monday through Friday. You go to work, you got to be there by 9, you leave at 5, and definitely that is a norm. That's a normal occurrence. So when we look at rites of passage, we have to begin to understand what it means from a normative approach. I'm talking about a normative approach. The normative approach is an approach when you take a look at your norms, what has normally been done in Africa, what has normally been done amongst African women. So whenever we talk about rites of passage, we have to come from what is called a normative approach as it relates to an African woman. So the people who teach this are the elders. The elder women of our communities, they come in and they teach you about what is a normative approach. What is a woman supposed to do day to day? What is normal for a woman and how is she supposed to conduct herself? So a lot of times, you know, it is very difficult for us to process how to be a woman, but the only clear and true example that we had is from another woman. So when I look at the examples of what I've just shown you, Harriet Tubman, Shirley Chisholm, and all of the other ones that I've just stated to you, the question again is, what do they have in common? Well, they all came from a woman. Okay, so when we say they all came from a woman, they all come from an idea of how a woman should behave. So this normative approach is instituted within our own families. Now, does that mean to say, hey, every woman understands what the normative approach is? No, sometimes people need a little bit more. You know, sometimes they don't have this great influence from a grandmother or this great influence from an auntie or a great influence from a mother as a shining example. Well, sometimes we do have those examples and we fail to follow suit. So sometimes when you see this, you know, sometimes it's great for children to actually go through, again, go through an initiation phase to make sure that they understand the principles in which they're to live by. So for me, entering into a rites of passage program, it was an initiation phase to see and make sure that I understood, not just by example of what I saw my mother do, or not just by the example of what I saw my grandmother live by, or my great-grandmother live by. They were incredible women. But it was for me to be able to understand the rules and what it takes to operate as an African woman. Now, and to also be reminded once because most women, you will go astray of the principles, but it's to kind of gear you back into a proper way of behaving. So when I talk about this normative approach, there are other approaches that are used in African ethics, you know, and things that we do in our culture. And some of these other things are exemplified through things like what's called a prescriptive approach. And normally it's kind of like writing a doctor's prescription. When you go to the doctor, you actually he writes you a prescription and which you're supposed to take for the next 30 days or 10 days or 15 days, whatever it is. But you actually, you know, he gives you a prescription. And, you know, a lot of times people don't understand what prescription is. They just get it, they take it, they do it. But it's a prescriptive or a prescriptive approach is something that is put in writing or something that is left for you to follow. So a lot of times for women, we have in rites of passage, we've actually looked at this thing of in writing. We looked at the prescription. Now, the biggest type of prescription that we take a look at or that we need to look at is the Bible or the Quran or whatever spiritual text of that time period. So in Africa, of course, there was certain prescription. It may have been in African languages. It may have been in other another prescriptive text, but there was a prescription that actually where people were able to refer to. So a lot of times in ethics and the African code of ethics, we look at what that prescription is. And in a rites of passage program, it is very important to look at what the prescription says. And that prescription is actually held by the elders. So sometimes they will take certain texts, sometimes they will take certain things that have been left before them in order to guide us into a way of practice. So that's another approach, is a prescriptive approach. The other thing that is highly taught in the Rites of Passage program, and this is one thing that I would honestly say that is the most important for your children to actually be involved in the Rites of Passage program, especially within SHABAZZ University, is to talk about etiquette. You know, when you go into a courtroom, there is a certain etiquette that is expected of you. I remember in my law school class, it was really interesting because, you know, the first thing we were taught coming into law school was we could not use fingernail polish. And we had to actually use clear nail polish. It could not be any color. It could not be red. It could not be orange. It could not be yellow. It could not be green. You had to use clear nail polish. And that was strange to me because I didn't understand. I say, hey, I just want to be into my own, you know, we as an African people, we are a cultured people. We are we are in charge of the arts and we love beauty and artistic expression. Who are you to deny me? Who are you to deny me the ability to show my nail color? But in retrospect, we have to understand as an African people, there are certain rules of etiquette, and there are things that are used in order to, you know, win your case. You know, if you go into a courtroom, you don't want to come in a jumpsuit and some jeans, and you're going before a judge, and he looks at you and says, you know, what is this? I mean, you're not going to a club tonight. You're coming before a forum. And you want me to believe and accept what you're saying to me as being a truthful expression of your case. However, you come before me in a way and or in a manner that is disrespectful to what they call the forum. You know, in court, there's a forum that you must practice. Okay, there is a court forum. And that forum teaches you to conduct yourself in a certain manner. Your mannerism when you're speaking to a judge or to opposing counsel has to be in a certain manner. Your conduct has to be civilized according to the American system. And so when you enter into any type of forum, you must conduct yourself appropriately. So what I want to talk about here is this etiquette. And in Africa, we also have an etiquette. And in America, these traditions have been passed on to us. So some of the things in which we're talking about etiquette, we're talking about, you know, a situation where we have a way of that we're supposed to look and function and serve our people. So the etiquette is, I mean, not just serve our people, but we're supposed to operate as an African woman in a certain context. So I'm going to go ahead and now discuss, it is these, one moment. I am going to discuss, this is what I need. I am going to discuss a part of what do I mean by etiquette. Some of the women we've taken a look at, for example, let's go back to Shirley Chisholm. And I just asked my assistant to print out a couple of other examples because I wanted to actually show you what has happened in our history. Let's go to Winnie Mandela. If we take a look at Winnie, we can see that, yes, of course, yes, she has on an African head wrap. She has on glasses, she has on lipstick and all of that other stuff, but it's very professional and her decorum is great. Let's take a look at another one. Because this is very important, and until my assistant comes back with the rest of the slides, I'm going to go ahead and make sure that you get a glimpse of pretty much the style and how we used to look. All right, so this is a picture of Amy Garvey, and it is interesting because In this picture, even though it's a black and white photo, she doesn't show to be any lipstick. Her shirt is not open below threshold of showing her breast. There's a lot of things in this photo in which we must pay attention to in regards to how a black woman looks. Let's take Coretta Scott King. Coretta is just wearing just basic lipstick. Her eyebrows aren't painted on. And she is still beautiful. All of these women are absolutely beautiful. But what we must understand is that they are in their natural form. They're in their natural Betty Shabazz. Betty is also, she has no, even if she has on lipstick, no painted eyebrows, no Botox in the lips. The nose is not, it's natural in nature. And let's take Rosa Parks. You know, all the women I'm showing you are a certain type of classy women. And what I've really realized is that this etiquette has not been good to us. You know, now what we see, and I'm going to show you a picture of this here really quickly. You know, these type of images we show now with these women that we have are just, if we take a look at this picture here, we can see, and I'm sorry I will have to show you here like this, but I just wanted to give you an example of what it is that we're watching right now. So as you can see here, this is another picture, if you can see up close, compared to the pictures that I just printed. And this is now pretty much what we've come to with our women. We've come to looking at a woman that is with blue eyes, red lipstick, eyebrows painted on, eyelashes painted on. And we want to know, where does this come from? Where does this image of a black woman stem from? This is another photo I'm going to show you in which we have to take a look at. Now, of course, the body image is what people will take a look at and say, hey, you know, this is a woman, there's nothing wrong with showing your body and your assets or whatever else that you may have. But there's a certain decorum. And we as a people have failed to actually pay attention to that decorum in which we're supposed to have, the etiquette in which I speak of. This is another example of how we used to look in the past, and I wish I had the actual shots. However, with some technical difficulty, we were unable to retrieve them. But this is a picture from the 1960s. And as you can see, the woman here from the 1960s, it is shown that, you know, you can see her and just her natural self. There's another picture here that I want to show you. And this is also of another woman. And these are just random women from 1960s and before. Maybe this was in the 1940s. But I just wanted to let you know what we have transitioned from and where we're going to. There's another natural shot. This woman here with her natural aura and her natural hair. Her shirt is still buttoned up all the way to the top. It's not very provocative. And this is where we're coming from here. I mean, this is what's happening. We're coming from these type of images. And we're moving on to a woman who is showing us images of this. So when we talk about ethics, and again, when we talk about ethics and we talk about rites of passage, the key is, how do we get back? How do we get back to some of the foundations, some of the fundamental principles that have exemplified Black women? How do we merge and clearly understand and not abandon tradition, the tradition in which we have been blessed with, and it is right here in the palm of our hands? Our children are going through a disservice, and all of our children not being able to understand what true beauty of the Black woman is. You know, there is a true beauty that is of African women. And with all of the images in social media and all of the images in which we see and which are pressed before us on social media, it makes us believe that this is the only way or the customary way for our people to live by as an African woman. When the truth is of the matter is that we have our ancestors, before they left this earth, they left certain principles and they left certain information for us to process. They left a normative approach. They left a prescription. The prescription is very clear. All these images are nothing but prescription. What they have done is put it in a text. So when you read a book about Amy Garvey, you're reading about the beauty. They have laid the foundation in which a woman is supposed to live by. So when we take a look at these type of people and we take a look at what we have here, we have a woman or women, a history of women that have laid in our precedent for us to follow. It is very important that we keep in context with the traditions of our people. It is so necessary that our children are active participants in a rites of passage program. Because what we must understand is that everything that I discussed as far as the normative, prescriptive approach, social morality, I haven't even gotten into the crux of what I'm going to talk about, but I gave you a snippet view of certain prescriptions and certain texts and certain theories and philosophical theories of how to look at the rites of passage program. I came from a standpoint, a philosophical standpoint of how we as a people describe it. And when you're transitioning from childhood to adulthood, it is very important to understand the prescription that is laid before us. In that prescription is etiquette. In that prescription is social behavior, the way that we're supposed to operate as an African people, as an African woman. So what I want everyone to do, I want you to sign up your child to SHABAZZ University. If you don't do it for, let's say, if you don't do it because you feel like, it is not what you need, understand this. The initiation of your child going through a rites of passage is a learning phase. It is a learning, it's a child in progression. When I say it's a child in progression, it's a child that's learning how to become a self-determined Black woman. In the rites of passage program, education is the most significant principle. Learning, understanding just the systematic responsibility and the role of a Black woman, understanding how to behave, understanding how ethics and how African ethics and moral codes play a large part into our learning capacity and abilities and our practices. So it is so fundamental for a Black woman to really begin to dig in and to really understand what is a woman, what it means to be a woman. We just think the difference between man and woman is just in body parts. When the truth of the matter, that's one of them, but that's not the only. The difference between man and woman is our learning. The way we learn, there are certain ways of learning and behaviors that we must adopt. Womanhood is something that is taught. And at this time, I must say, I'll give thanks to our ancestors that have come before us, because but for them, there will be no prescription for us to follow. So in this session and in this segment, I hope you have enjoyed what you have seen here today. I hope we have made a clear example of how important it is to understand the relevance and the philosophy behind education, the philosophy behind the moral code, the philosophy behind African, about how to live like an African and how to live like an African woman and why it's important. Some of the things, again, we're going to cover in our next sessions. We're going to continue this and we're going to go into detail with some of the things that I first talked about. And again, all of this is so important to the functionality of our people. You know, we have to be a self-determined people. But in order to be self-determined, it starts with what we do today. It really starts with what we do today. And if I could, every child that grows up, I wouldn't say that they have the ability to just enter into a rites of passage program. But with you looking at this segment, I hope that you will take advantage of the opportunity to enroll your child. It is probably the best experience that a child can go through. I am thankful, and I give a shout out to my ancestors, the ones who have come before me, who have laid the foundation for the rites of passage program that I've experienced. And I give thanks to the higher power for being able to continue the legacy of making sure that our children and our custom and our culture are preserved. So please go again to www.shabazzuniversity.com, or you can call 202-549-4205 for more information. I'll repeat the number, 202-549-4205. Hopefully you've enjoyed this segment, and visit us again next week for SHABAZZ University Rites of Passage 101 for Girls, Part 2. Thank you so much, Dr. Amy Jenkins. Yeah. Okay.